There comes a point in life when your inner voice is yelling at you to walk away, yet your body remains frozen in place. You sit quietly in rooms that leave you drained, engage in conversations that twist your heart, surrounded by people who fail to recognize your presence, let alone your value. And still you stay. You respond. You justify. You attempt to mend, to appease, to keep the peace with individuals who only feel empowered when you're diminished. According to Carl Jung, this is not a noble act. It's a symptom of the false self. You don't stay because it's the honorable choice. You stay because at some point in your early life, you were conditioned to believe that leaving was selfish, not explaining was impolite, and staying silent made you heartless. But what if everything you learned was completely wrong? Imagine this. Every time you react to disrespect, you tie yourself tighter to relationships that don't honor you. Each moment spent justifying your worth to someone who has already decided not to see it is a trap. Staying just to prove that you are good slowly chips away at your inner peace. This is where Jung's shadow work begins, with the piece of your psyche that still can't walk away. The part that needs approval even from people who repeatedly ignore your value. Let's explore this more deeply. Most individuals who find it nearly impossible to disappear were once children who were never allowed to. As kids, they were burdened with managing their parents' emotional states. They were taught that love was conditional, something to be earned by fixing, helping, and pleasing. They absorbed stress like a sponge and renamed it loyalty. So now when someone overlooks them, they don't exit. They overextend. They try harder. They seek understanding. They dive deeper into situations that were never meant to be understood, only controlled. That's the bitter truth that becomes liberating. If someone thrives on your confusion, they'll never want you to find clarity. And your fatigue? That's not weakness. That's your spirit screaming, "This isn't love, it's trauma bonding." But awakening to that reality hurts, because disappearing means facing the painful illusion. Maybe they'll change if I just stay a little longer. Maybe they'll see my worth if I phrase it just right. Maybe there's still something to salvage. But Jung was unapologetically clear. The most terrifying thing a person can do is fully accept who they are. Because once you accept your truth, you lose the ability to tolerate situations that contradict it. You can no longer fight to prove your goodness to people who've already judged you as less than. You must disappear, but not in anger. Not with a slammed door or a silent protest. You disappear with calm, with clarity, with sacred withdrawal. Jung never suggested vanishing from life itself. He spoke of retreating from the roles that are slowly suffocating your essence. The fixer, the explainer, the endlessly available version of yourself that stretches and bends just to be accepted. You don't need to be picked there. You need to pick yourself. But let's not pretend it's easy. Choosing absence over approval often feels like death, because when your entire identity was constructed around being everything for everyone, choosing silence feels like betrayal. You'll question everything. You'll second-guess your decision. You'll grieve for the version of you that used to rush in, respond, and justify, just for the slim chance of being seen. If you cling to those old habits, though, you'll never discover what freedom actually looks like. Because a different life awaits you on the other side of disappearing. There's a quiet strength in not replying, a liberation in resisting the urge to explain. And real healing begins not when you're understood, but when you walk away without trying to be. This isn't ghosting. It's not about cruelty. It's about reclaiming your dignity. When someone breaks your inner peace and expects you to tolerate it, Leaving becomes a boundary. Remaining silent is wisdom. Choosing not to justify is emotional maturity. That version of you who used to always respond, they were surviving. The one who explained and over-explained, they were trying to protect themselves. But the one who now disappears, that's the version ready to truly live. Jung taught us one of life's most powerful truths. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And who you truly are isn't someone begging to be heard or tirelessly trying to prove worth to those who lack the capacity to see it. You're not meant to chase people who can't even hold space for themselves. You are the person who knows. The moment you stop explaining, you begin evolving. The moment you stop reacting, you reclaim your power. And the moment you disappear, not from life, but from distortion, your real journey starts. But the truth is, the transformation doesn't feel glorious at first. It feels like a spiral. You don't feel calm or free. You feel like you're falling apart. That guilt, that unbearable silence, it's your old programming waging war against your new awareness. Inside, there's a voice whispering, maybe I was too cold. Maybe I should just clarify. One more message, one last explanation. That's the internal battle Jung warned us about. The tug-of-war between your conditioned self and your authentic self. And it's brutal, because breaking out of lifelong patterns doesn't bring instant peace. Your nervous system doesn't celebrate. It panics. You see, you weren't merely taught to be polite. You were conditioned to survive through validation. You were molded to believe that safety lies in being agreeable, in being liked, in being accepted. So when you stop reacting to manipulation, when you choose not to explain yourself anymore, when you walk away from places where your value was constantly up for negotiation, your body doesn't interpret that as growth. It senses threat. Why? Because in your past, staying small kept you safe. Being pleasant kept you protected. Explaining your actions helped you avoid punishment. So now, when you assert yourself through silence or departure, your nervous system misreads it as danger. It screams, "This isn't safe. Go back." But here's where Jung's shadow work provides clarity. The guilt you feel isn't evidence that you did something wrong. It's proof that you're healing the part of yourself that was never allowed to leave. Let that sink in. Your guilt isn't truth. It's the echo of old trauma. This is where many falter. They mistake guilt for wrongdoing. They see discomfort and assume they've crossed a line, so they retreat. They text again. They apologize unnecessarily. They over-explain just to feel momentarily safe. And with every return to the familiar dysfunction, they lose more of themselves. Here lies the psychological trap. Toxic people don't seek closure. They seek control. And your guilt is their most effective weapon. You've been trained to feel ashamed for choosing peace. You were told that disappearing meant you were heartless, unkind, even selfish. But disappearing, when done in self-respect, is the most courageous act of self-love. Jung called this withdrawing projections, the reclaiming of energy from people who never deserved your emotional investment in the first place. It's a refusal to let your identity be defined by how others see you. It's seeing the truth. Some relationships only function if you keep betraying yourself. But this clarity, it's not neat. It's messy. There's a withdrawal phase, just like breaking any addiction. Because you weren't just attached to the person or the toxic environment, you were addicted to your role in it. You were the one who smoothed things over, the reliable responder, the peacekeeper, the explainer. So when you no longer play that part, you feel hollow, aimless, even disposable. But here is the turning point. That emptiness you feel, it isn't a void, it's a clearing. And in that space is the birth of your true power. For the first time, you're not giving your energy to a black hole of approval. You're not spending your days emotionally reacting to people who never tried to understand you. You're stepping into sovereignty. Carl Jung's concept of individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires you to face what feels like an inner death. It's not about superficial change. It's about letting old versions of yourself die. The people-pleasing version. The one who always said yes. The version who existed only to gain approval, to avoid conflict, to feel worthy. That version kept you in survival mode. And now, for the first time, you're stepping out of that role. This is why disappearing isn't just hard, it's heartbreaking. You're not just cutting off communication. You're cutting the psychological cord that linked your self-worth to being needed, accepted, or liked. That's not easy. It requires you to grieve a self you've outgrown. And grief by nature is messy. You'll find yourself missing the very people who hurt you. You'll begin romanticizing the pain, convincing yourself that it wasn't really that bad. You'll start rewriting the story, making them seem better and making yourself seem worse, just so it doesn't hurt so much. This is a trauma reflex. Your mind, desperate to avoid discomfort, wants to return to what it knows, even if it was harmful. But this is the moment when your greatest evolution can begin, if you allow it. Instead of reaching back out, you stay, still, silent, unmoving. You let the silence speak. You let your nervous system adjust to a new reality. You give your new self a chance to arrive. Eventually, the guilt softens. The fog starts to lift. And in its place, something remarkable appears. Self-respect. The kind that doesn't need to be validated. The kind that doesn't require explanation or defense. The kind that quietly stands in its own presence. That's when you know you've grown. As Jung once said, loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that matter most. And that's why disappearing is sacred. In the quiet, you stop trying to speak to people who will never truly hear you. You begin having a conversation with yourself. You stop rewriting your story for others and begin writing it for you, for wholeness, not for sympathy. You're not vanishing out of bitterness. You're retreating into truth, into integrity, into the most honest version of you that's ever existed. And in that silence, you begin to ask different questions, deep questions, ones that don't rely on outside validation for answers. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I care about when there's no one to impress? Who am I becoming now that I'm no longer performing for love? These questions aren't easy. They can't be answered by a mirror or a mentor. They require you to look inward and sit with what you find. And sometimes, what you find is darkness, the wounds, the fear, the rage, the grief that you buried under performance and people-pleasing. But Jung said it clearly. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. So when you choose not to react, you confront the parts of you that formed just to keep you alive. The part that agreed when you wanted to say no. The part that stayed quiet when you should have screamed. The part that smiled while your soul shattered. These weren't flaws, they were survival strategies. But you're not surviving anymore. You've stepped out of survival. Now what you need is sovereignty. And sovereignty begins the moment you stop explaining yourself to people who only listen so they can respond, or worse, use your vulnerability against you. People who love you only when you're easy to manage, when you don't make waves, when you don't ask for more than they're willing to give. These people never saw you They saw your function, your reaction, your loyalty. So when you withdraw, when you stop performing the role they were attached to, something unexpected happens. They vanish. Not because you changed, but because you stopped feeding the pattern. And in that emptiness, something vital becomes clear. You were never crazy. You weren't overreacting. You weren't too sensitive. You were finally waking up. This awakening is what Jung called individuation, the slow, deliberate emergence of your whole self. But the cost of wholeness? It's temporary loneliness, because when you stop reacting, you're no longer vibrating on the same frequency as people who needed you fragmented. You're not emotionally available in the way they were used to. And that silence, that terrifying, spacious silence, that's where the miracle starts. You begin to rebuild, not to impress, not to prove, but simply to be. You establish boundaries, not to shut people out, but to let the right ones in. You speak, not to justify, but to express. You show up, not for attention, but for alignment. This is what disappearing does. It resets your inner compass. It filters out noise and reveals what peace truly feels like. You begin to realize that what you thought was connection was often just shared chaos. What you mistook for passion was sometimes just unhealed trauma. What you labeled as responsibility was actually guilt in disguise. Now you're clear on what matters, clear on what you'll no longer tolerate, clear on how you want to be treated. And it's in this clarity that a strange shift happens. Peace starts to feel powerful. At first, it might feel boring, but that boredom is actually your nervous system detoxing from years of chaos. It's recalibrating to stability. Carl Jung believed that we all carry unconscious patterns, shadows that quietly run our lives until we finally make them conscious. And that moment, it begins in stillness. When you choose not to react, not to chase closure, not to justify your pain, you're finally shining a light on those unconscious patterns. You're not disappearing to punish others. You're doing it to understand yourself, to map your inner wounds, to reclaim your story. Because once you deeply understand your own mind and emotions, no one can manipulate you again. No one can twist your words or guilt you into submission. You become emotionally untouchable, not because you don't feel, but because you now know exactly why you feel. This is the final stage of your transformation. When silence becomes your sanctuary, when solitude becomes your strength, when self-respect becomes your baseline. You'll know you've arrived when someone disrespects you and you no longer flinch. You don't explode. You don't justify. You simply smile and walk away. No need for drama, no lingering guilt, just peace. So now ask yourself one final question. Where in your life are you still explaining just to be tolerated? What relationships still demand a version of you that must shrink to fit? And what would truly happen if, instead of defending your presence, you simply chose silence? If this message touched something within you, if it made you pause, reflect, or breathe deeper, then like, comment your favorite line, and subscribe to our channel for more insights into healing, clarity, and personal power. You don't need to prove your worth. You just need to protect your peace. Just disappear.